There are moments in a criminal investigation when the entire weight of a case compresses down into something impossibly small, a fiber, a partial print, a microscopic smear of biological material that the naked eye would never notice. In this case, that moment has arrived, and what investigators are now working with is a single strand of hair, not a bundle, not a sweep of biological evidence from multiple sources. One hair, recovered from inside the bedroom of a woman who has been missing for over 80 days, a woman whose family has spent nearly 3 months oscillating between desperate hope and quiet devastation. The forensic community has been watching this case with growing frustration because the tools to process this kind of evidence have existed for years. Yet the timeline of how this hair was handled suggests that critical time may have already been lost. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand what a rootless hair actually means in the context of forensic science. For decades, the working assumption in DNA analysis was that hair without a root, meaning the bulb at the base that anchors it to the scalp, was essentially useless for identifying a specific individual. The root contains what is known as nuclear DNA, the genetic blueprint that carries information from both biological parents and creates a profile unique to that person. Without it, analysts were limited to mitochondrial DNA, which traces lineage through the maternal line only and cannot distinguish between individuals who share a common maternal ancestor. In practical terms, mitochondrial DNA can place someone in a family tree but cannot point a finger at one person. That limitation effectively made rootless hair a dead end in thousands of investigations. Evidence was collected, logged, and shelved because no one had figured out how to extract the more precise nuclear profile from a hair shaft alone. That changed when researchers developed a technique to extract what are known as SNP profiles, single nucleotide polymorphisms, from rootless hair. SNPs are tiny variations in the genetic sequence that are unique enough to support full genetic genealogy analysis, meaning investigators can build a family tree from the DNA profile and trace it back to a specific individual, even if that person has never submitted their DNA to any law enforcement database. The lab credited with pioneering this technique and proving the scientific community wrong has since applied it in dozens of active and cold cases, producing matches where none were thought possible. The significance of their work was cemented when rootless hairs recovered from the bodies of victims in a Long Island serial murder case were successfully analyzed, producing profiles that connected directly to the suspect's household. Those results survived a legal challenge, with a judge ruling the evidence admissible, setting a precedent that continues to shape how rootless hair evidence is used in courtrooms across the country. That same lab is now believed to be involved in processing the hair recovered from the missing woman's bedroom. What makes the current situation so troubling is the question of timing. The hair is said to have been in investigators' possession since February, and yet it was not immediately sent to the lab with the best documented success rate for this type of analysis. Instead, it went first to a different laboratory, one that forensic genealogy experts describe as having no publicly known successful cases involving the extraction of SNP profiles from rootless hair. Whether that lab attempted the analysis and failed, or whether the hair sat in their queue while the clock ticked away, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that weeks passed, possibly months, before the evidence found its way toward the specialists who were most capable of doing something with it. For a case built on urgency, on the possibility that a missing person might still be alive, that delay is not a footnote. It is a central failure that the public and the family deserve answers about. The mechanics of how that hair was likely collected in the first place point to the seriousness with which investigators treated the bedroom scene, at least initially. Forensic teams working in enclosed spaces where DNA is suspected to be present sometimes use a device known as a miniature vacuum air collection system, a tool that operates on principles similar to a wet-dry vacuum but is calibrated for evidence recovery. The device sprays a fine mist of liquid across a surface, whether fabric, carpet, or hardwood, and then draws it back through a filter, trapping microscopic biological material in the process. That filter is then processed for DNA. The advantage over traditional swabbing is significant. A swab covers whatever area the technician manually touches, while the vacuum-based system can cover an entire surface uniformly, dramatically increasing the likelihood of capturing trace evidence that might otherwise be missed. In a bedroom like the one in question, with upholstered furniture, fabric curtains, carpeted floors, and textile bedding, the number of surfaces where a single shed hair might have landed is enormous. The fact that investigators apparently recovered at least one viable hair through this process is itself a notable outcome. What happens to that hair in the laboratory, however, is where the case either advances or stalls. Extracting a SMP profile from a rootless hair is not a routine procedure. It requires multiple attempts in many cases, and the hair itself is consumed in the process, unlike blood or saliva samples, which can sometimes be retested after an initial analysis. Each extraction attempt draws down the available genetic material, and if the hair is short, or if it has been exposed to environmental factors such as chemical treatments or prolonged heat, the usable DNA content may already be degraded before the lab receives it. Forensic genealogists, who work regularly with rootless hair evidence, describe the process as one that demands both technical precision and a degree of luck. Some hairs are rich with extractable material, others yield almost nothing despite identical procedures. The uncertainty is real, and it is part of why the decision to send this evidence to the most capable available laboratory is not merely a procedural preference, but a strategic necessity. The concern now, voiced by experts who have tracked this case closely, is whether there is enough hair remaining after whatever testing was done at the first laboratory. If the initial lab attempted the SMP extraction and failed, a portion of the hair was used up in that attempt. If they ran multiple rounds of testing before concluding they could not produce a usable profile, even more material was consumed. What arrives at the specialized lab may be a fraction of what was originally recovered. Experts who have worked with this lab note that even they sometimes require multiple attempts and that not every hair they receive ultimately produces a viable match. The pressure on the forensic team is immense because the stakes could not be higher. If a profile is successfully extracted and a genetic genealogy analysis is completed, investigators will have their first solid biological lead, a thread they can pull to begin identifying who was in that bedroom, who may have come into contact with the missing woman, and who might be responsible for her disappearance. If the hair gives out before a profile is generated, that thread disappears entirely. Running parallel to the forensic uncertainty is a breakdown in institutional credibility that has complicated every stage of this investigation. The sheriff overseeing the case has become a story unto himself. Reports surfaced that during a formal deposition, he stated definitively that he had never been suspended as a result of disciplinary action during his career in law enforcement. That statement has since been directly contradicted by records showing multiple suspensions during his time at a previous department, totaling dozens of days of unpaid leave over a span of years. The allegations of perjury that followed are being disputed by his legal team on the grounds that the question may have been misunderstood. Whether that defense holds or collapses, the damage to public trust in the investigation's leadership has already been done. A vote of no confidence from his own department reflects an internal fracture that inevitably radiates outward into the day-to-day functioning of an investigation that can afford no further distractions. The investigative picture grows even more complicated when ransom correspondence is factored in. Notes have surfaced claiming the missing woman was seen alive in the Mexican state of Sonora, a vast and geographically challenging region that shares a long border with Arizona. The same correspondence, in a detail that carries enormous weight, asserts that she is no longer alive. Investigators and security professionals who have operational experience working in that region describe the prospect of a search there as presenting challenges that go well beyond difficult terrain. Sonora encompasses enormous stretches of desert that are effectively inaccessible to conventional search methods. Aerial surveillance using drones, while theoretically possible, runs directly into the reality that large portions of this land are under the effective control of organized criminal networks that do not welcome surveillance of any kind. Coordinating a legitimate cross-border investigation requires formal cooperation between two governments, compliance from local law enforcement agencies that operate under entirely different accountability structures, and the willingness of local communities to provide information, all of which are complicated enormously by the influence cartel organizations exert over daily life throughout much of the region. Security professionals with direct experience extracting missing persons from Mexico and other high-risk territories note that even in the most cooperative circumstances, a cross-border search produces results that are slower and less reliable than a domestic operation. Corruption within local law enforcement is a structural reality, not an anomaly, and the capacity of outside investigators to operate freely is essentially dependent on the goodwill of agencies that may themselves have compromised relationships with the groups that investigators are trying to penetrate. Without a credible first-hand witness who can provide specific geographic information, not a general claim that someone was seen somewhere in a state the size of a small country. A search in Sonora would be extraordinarily difficult to focus, let alone conclude successfully. The note, whatever its origin, cannot be dismissed without investigation, but the operational obstacles it presents are severe enough that experienced field operatives treat it with measured skepticism. Meanwhile, the human toll of 80-plus days of this kind of investigative volatility is visible in every corner of the case. Law enforcement professionals who work missing persons cases describe a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in when leads repeatedly surface and then dissolve. When a tip triggers a surge of activity, resources are mobilized, the media picks up the story, expectations build, and then nothing comes of it. That cycle, repeated multiple times, creates a psychological pattern that affects investigators just as it affects families and the public. The impulse to protect oneself from the emotional crash that follows each failed lead can gradually erode the urgency that drives effective investigative work. Behavioral analysts who study crisis investigations describe it as a feedback loop. Sensationalized activity creates anticipation. Failure creates deflation. Deflation creates protective withdrawal. Withdrawal creates a slower, less energized response to the next lead. For the family at the center of this case, that loop is experienced not as a professional challenge, but as a personal one, as the feeling that the institutional apparatus meant to find their loved one is slowly losing its grip on the urgency of what it is doing. The family has also had to weather a sustained assault of online speculation, some of it malicious, some of it simply thoughtless, that has transformed a real and ongoing human tragedy into a subject for armchair investigators and social media theorists. Claims have been made about various members of the family, including the missing woman's son-in-law. Others have suggested, with no basis in evidence or logic, that family members with public profiles somehow engineered the disappearance for professional gain. These theories are not merely offensive, they are harmful to the investigation because they redirect public attention away from the actual evidentiary questions and toward narratives that serve no one except the people generating online engagement at the expense of a family in crisis. What this case ultimately comes down to, stripped of the noise and the institutional failures and the grotesque speculation, is a forensic question. Can one hair produce enough genetic information to give investigators a name? That is the operative question on which everything else depends. Forensic genealogists who have worked the most difficult cases of this type emphasize that the technique, while genuinely groundbreaking, is not infallible. Some hair samples are more genetically rich than others. The condition in which the hair was preserved, the number of prior analytical attempts made on it, the length of the strand, whether it was exposed to any chemical treatments. All of these factors influence the probability of a successful extraction. A longer hair gives the lab more genetic material to work with. A hair that has been dyed or treated creates additional interference. A hair that has already been through one round of failed extraction has less material remaining for a second attempt. The variables are real, and pretending they do not exist does no one any favors. What forensic professionals have learned from cases where rootless hair was successfully analyzed is that when a profile is produced, it becomes the foundation on which everything else is built. A genetic genealogy analysis can generate a family tree from that profile, identifying relatives of the hair's contributor through publicly available genealogy databases. Investigators can then work outward from those relatives to identify the contributor themselves, narrowing the field through geographic and biographical analysis until a primary candidate emerges. That candidate becomes the subject of follow-up investigation, their movements, their digital footprint, their connections to the victim's life. In one high-profile quadruple homicide case, a single DNA sample that was invisible to the naked eye, found on a knife sheath at the crime scene, produced exactly this kind of cascading identification. Everything that followed in that prosecution traced back to that one sample. The hair in the current case has the potential to function the same way as the first brick in what becomes a structure of evidence solid enough to support a prosecution. The sheriff's legal troubles, whatever their ultimate resolution, represent a problem that extends beyond one individual's credibility. When the public face of an investigation is consumed by personal controversy, it sends a signal to investigators, to the family, to the public, that the institutional center of the case is unstable. The deputies who issued a no-confidence vote are not making an abstract procedural statement. They are communicating that the leadership of this agency has lost their trust, and trust is the currency on which collaborative investigations run. The federal involvement in this case is, under these circumstances, more than a procedural formality. It is the structural backstop that may be keeping the investigation from completely losing coherence. Federal resources, federal forensic capacity, and federal investigative authority operate independently of the county sheriff's personal legal situation, and that independence may prove to be what keeps this case from going cold in every meaningful sense of the word. For the family, Mother's Day will arrive in the middle of an investigation that has no confirmed resolution, in a moment that crystallizes everything they are living with. There will be no ordinary celebration, no ordinary grief, no ordinary anything. There will only be the waiting for a lab result, for a tip that holds, for a lead that does not evaporate by morning. The forensic genealogists who have worked cases like this one describe a particular quality to the moment when a rootless hair finally yields a profile, the sensation of a door opening where there was only a wall before. Whether that moment comes in this case, and whether it comes before the hair runs out, is not something anyone can promise. What can be said is that the technology is real, the stakes are absolute, and the one remaining question is whether enough evidence survived the delays to give investigators the answer they need.